Welcome back to Face the Nation. I'm John Dickerson. Joining us now for our political panel, we have Michael Duffy, Deputy Managing Editor of Time Magazine. This year's Time Magazine Person of the Year is Donald Trump. Jamelle Bouie is a CBS News political analyst and chief political correspondent at Slate. Lisa Lehrer is national politics reporter for the Associated Press, and Michael Gerson is a columnist for the Washington Post. Michael Duffy, let's start with Russia and the election. What do you make of it, and what do you make of Donald Trump's response to the intelligence community? Let's start there.
Well, I think there are two shocks, and it's important not to overreact or underreact to either of them. The facts on the ground that the intelligence community has concluded that Russia tried to turn the election to Donald Trump is deeply disturbing. It means that Russia attacked the United States. And an investigation, a bipartisan investigation, under some banner, as John McCain said, is inevitable now. But the second shock is Donald Trump's reaction. He seems to be implying or suggesting, both in his tweets and his comments, that he's not really interested in what happened during the election. He doesn't think whatever happened should affect U.S.-Russian relations going forward. And he's drawn a fairly dark cloud over his relationship with the intelligence community, on whom he will rely and need as president, and need to be successful as president. So I think sweeping this stuff under the rug as a first reaction might be at his own peril.
Jamelle, as Michael points out, that the distinction here on the CIA and what they seem to have found, what's new here, we heard about Russian involvement potentially while the election was going on, but what seems to be new is that it was targeted to help Donald Trump. That seems to be the new development, that in order to just update people on where things are.
Right, exactly. We've sort of had knowledge and suspicion that the Russian government has been involved in, helping leak documents, and engaging in election interference that way. But that's different. That's materially different than the suggestion that, hey, they were doing this specifically to help Donald Trump. I'm sort of in this place right now where I'm not entirely sure, beyond investigations, beyond sort of serious scrutiny of this, what we do about this, because it really is unprecedented. And if it is true, if we have further verification of this, then what it suggests potentially is that the election was in some sense illegitimate. And I don't know where you go from there.
Right, Lisa, is anybody calling, because where you would go, if you take that as a conclusion, then that takes you somewhere more than an investigation. That's kind of stop the process or stop the process. Is anybody calling for that right yet?
Nobody's calling for that. That, of course, is Donald Trump's number one fear, is that this will destroy this sweeping mandate that he believes he has. He, of course, does not have that, since it was unlike what he's claimed again and again. It was a very tight race, and Hillary Clinton had, won the popular vote by a large margin. But, that doesn't mean you don't look into this. Look, fair and free elections are the fundamental underpinning of American democracy. We live in this conspiracy era age, as we saw from the proliferation of fake news over the election. You're playing a dangerous game if you start having voters and the electorate lose confidence in the integrity of our elections. So it is really important to investigate this, whether it changes the outcome or not. And Hillary Clinton's team did a really extensive investigation of whether there was any systemic manipulation of results from Russians or otherwise, and they found that the answer was no. So her team is even saying that this could have potentially, the election was rigged or something like that. But, the investigation has to happen regardless.
Michael Gerson, as Michael Duffy was saying, presidents that get in fights with their CIA or with their intelligence community,
they lose. I can't think of an instance where a White House and the CIA got into conflict where the CIA did not win through leaks and other things. I mean, that is the history of this. But even more importantly, we face such a variety of threats right now. If it's China in the South China Sea, or if it's North Korea nukes, or it's threats for Russia to the Baltic states, we need a good relationship between the intelligence community and the president. And people I talked to in the intelligence community about this were most offended by the ad hominem nature of this attack. They felt like, one told me, I feel like he's, attacking little Marco or lying Ted, okay? That's the way he's treating his intelligence community.
And, I think this is also a really interesting moment for domestic politics. Donald Trump is really putting his own party in an impossible position. Either they go against their incoming president, who's shown a propensity, as you point out, for these ad hominem attacks, or they go against voters, a majority of which don't trust Russia, and a significant portion of which would like to see a tougher line against Russia. So I think part of what John McCain is doing is giving the rest of the party cover by calling for these investigations, but it's not an easy way to start that relationship.
Well, I was going to say one other thing about where we're going here in terms of an investigation, in terms of future events, regardless of what's happened already. We know from the campaign, John, that Democratic emails were vacuumed up and leaked. We don't know exactly how much was vacuumed up from the Republican emails, but we now know from the reports about the intelligence community's assessment that they also got Republican emails, which means someone, if that's true, and of course the RNC has denied this, but if it's true, and it stands to reason that it may be true, then someone in Moscow or in Russia is holding onto all of those emails too. And those affect not Hillary Clinton, but Donald Trump, presumably, as he steps into the role of president. Right. So whatever force in Russia that is in control of this information or this now stands in a position to exert some leverage, if it is true, over the future president.
It's worth saying as well that we have very little information on Donald Trump's financial ties, on sort of his business dealings globally. So it's entirely possible that in addition to that information, there are reams of information about Trump's relationship with financial interests in Russia that we're sort of completely blind to and opaque to.
It's not clear that Putin loves Donald Trump. We know that he did not like Hillary Clinton, right? And that's an important distinction. You know, he certainly could turn on Trump or the Republicans just as quickly if it was in his interest.
And just to help those who may not have been following along, the New York Times has reported that these emails may have been hacked at the Republican committee. The Trump campaign and the RNC are pushing very much against that. Kellyanne Conway was trying to bring that up. I was focused more on points A and B, but they dispute that New York Times claim.
I would dispute it too, but I
mean, if you were in their position,
I would. But I think it's potentially quite a big lever if the evidence takes us in that direction. I think it's something we all are looking for as the next step in this investigation.
Right. So, Michael Gerson, let's switch a little bit to the Trump the cabinet picks he's made. Sure. Let's start with the Secretary of State. Rex Tillerson, the CEO of Exxon, is in the mix maybe, although now Donald Trump has tweeted today and he said the following: whether I choose him, this is Tillerson, or not for state, Rex Tillerson, the chairman and CEO of ExxonMobil, is a world-class player and deal maker, period. Stay tuned, exclamation point. The Secretary of State pick has been a bouncing ball. It's kind of been interesting to follow. What do you make of how this is going?
Well, I kind of feel bad for Tillerson in a certain way because he comes into this context. He's a very competent guy, respected business leader. But in the midst of all this, his views on Russia are going to get hyper scrutiny. And Russia wants one thing more than anything else, which is to get rid of the sanctions without changing their behavior. Okay, and Tillerson has opposed sanctions in the past, has a history of opposing sanctions. And so he's going to be put in this context. He seemed like a qualified nominee who some people are going to say is a payoff for services rendered.
Lisa, do you think there's a trial balloon aspect to this? Donald Trump now saying whether I choose him or not. I mean, this has been sort of the fourth or fifth name for Secretary of State. Is this trial by response, and then he'll make another choice?
Well, the process has been remarkable to watch, and what's been one of the most striking things to me has been the vast policy differences between the people whose names are being considered. So you have Tillerson, who of course opposed sanctions and won the Friendship Medal from Russia, and then you have Mitt Romney, who in 2012 people now say didn't get enough credit for calling Russia the biggest geopolitical threat. This feels more like who's going to get the rose, It's a personality contest. Clearly that's what Donald Trump, he likes executives, he likes people who are big presence. He said himself he wants someone who looks the part. So that's been really interesting, and I think it gives us some insight into how Donald Trump is going to make decisions and what we can expect.
Jamel, what do you make of the other choices that Donald Trump has made or not made? There have been all kinds of people going by the cameras at Trump Tower. Some of them get jobs, and then some of them, like Al Gore, are there. We're not sure for what reason. But the reason I say that is that Donald Trump's pick for the EPA, Scott Pruitt, is an opponent of the EPA. Donald Trump said he wants to basically dismantle the EPA. Do we have a situation here in which department heads are being asked to go in and basically take apart their departments?
I think we may. This is not just true of Trump's pick for the EPA, but for the Labor Department, for the Department of Education. You have picks that seem to be opposed to the missions of those agencies. I cannot recall the name of Trump's pick for the Labor Department at this moment, but he is a longtime opponent of raising minimum wages. He is a longtime opponent of unionization. He's a longtime opponent, basically, of anything workers can do to organize themselves and sort of advocate for themselves. And that's a very odd choice to have for a department that has jurisdiction over, say, the National Labor Relations Department.
Right. Andrew Puzder is the nominee for
There's no question this is setting up to be the closest, like a cabinet or a government, an executive branch with the closest relationship between government and business, at least since Ronald Reagan and maybe since Eisenhower. But I was just going to say that in a race that was supposedly about outsiders versus insiders, about non-elites versus elites, this is shaping up to be a group of consummate insiders. 2 governors, half a dozen CEOs, several people from Goldman Sachs, representatives. And Trump gave that amazing quote yesterday where he said, or maybe it was Friday, where he said, "I want people that made a fortune."
Yeah.
Because he believes that people with money negotiate from strength, which is interesting in a public service or a government job, because you think that the strength that they negotiate from is the will of the people, the consent of the governed. But he wants that added piece, which is he doesn't just want that, he wants something extra.
I think there's a fallacy there, too, about business leaders and military leaders, that their habits of command, their approach to governing can transfer to governing. I mean, sometimes, we don't know if the person who built up the World Wrestling Federation can run the SBA, the Small Business Association.
But we're going to find out.
Yeah, you have to lead career bureaucrats, get the best work out of them. You have to come up with policy ideas, trying to get in the State of the Union. There's a bunch of skills that, it's not an exact overlap.
For a guy who promised to drain the swamp, it's awfully murky in Washington these days. And, it's not just the business leaders, it's, of course, the donors. Linda McMahon, the incoming head of the SBA, gave $7 million to Trump's super PAC. That's a third of all the money that super PAC collected. So you do wonder, is there a certain point at which his supporters, he ran on this very populist message, say, this isn't what we bargained for.
And he specifically said he wouldn't have big donors or lobbyists
Right.
in his administration, so he's gone back on that.
So I think this gets to the nature of Trump's populism. For as much as I think right now it's characterized as being against elites, it's elites as agents of immigration. It's elites as agents of tolerating black protesters, right? It's elites as they relate to non-whites in America. And I have the suspicion that as long as Trump continues to cast elitism as being somehow racial, that elitism is a function of tolerating all these foreign elements in the United States, that Trump's voters aren't going to particularly care about who he appoints to cabinet agencies.
I would say the one thing that unites all Republicans, McConnell, Ryan, Trump, is undoing the Obama legacy. I think that's about a lot of these appointments are about that. He wants to undo the regulatory approach, undo executive orders. In fact, there's been a process to review under the Federalist Society a bunch of executive orders, so they're ready on day one to revoke them. So I do think that's a kind of a unifying goal. We don't know what he wants to do in a bunch of different areas, but that's pretty common between Republicans.
All right, we're going to have to end it there. Thanks to all of you. Gosh, so much to get to. All right, thanks to all of you, and we'll be back in a moment. Last week, a mistrial was declared in the shooting death of a black man, Walter Scott, by a white police officer in South Carolina. And it also marked the beginning of the trial of Dylan Roof, who admits killing 9 in a shooting rampage at the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston. Both incidents have put a painful focus on race relations in the state, which we talked about with South Carolina Senator Tim Scott.
Donald Trump ran for president saying, I'm going to be the law and order president. How does that come across in the community?
Well, I think people define it differently, law and order. I see law and order as a good, constructive part of what makes the community safer. And so my approach and my perspective is that a law and order type of environment will be conducive for a higher quality of life. You'll see more folks hopefully out in the streets enjoying their neighborhoods than you have in the past. And you'll have more law enforcement officers understanding and appreciating the communities by spending time getting to know those communities when there is no incident to come and investigate. So I'm fairly optimistic about that concept of law and order.
What some people heard when he talked about law and order was a kind of force first, a kind of escalation of fear about the community, about the inner cities. And some people believe that creates a state of fear that works against all the work you've been doing to try and create empathy.
I would hope not, and certainly people hear different things when they hear law and order. My hope is that what we'll do over time is we'll see that progress has not been stymied under a Trump administration, but we'll see that it has prospered. We're going to have to be very careful on what we do and what we say in circumstances so as to bring people together and not sow seeds that are poisonous.
Donald Trump knows how to put on a good show. We saw him do it with Carrier, and not only protected jobs, but sent a message to working people all across the country. What could he do on these sets of issues having to do with community relationships with police that would have that same kind of message sending capability?
Well, one of the fastest things he could do that would bring about great change is to embrace our opportunity agenda that we've been working on for the last 3 or 4 years. It starts with understanding that every zip code in this country needs quality education. And if there's not a quality school in your neighborhood, we should make sure that there is one, whether that's charter schools or virtual schools or magnet schools or private schools. Realize that every student does not want to go to college. So having a dual track in education, you're too young to remember SHOP in high schools.
I took SHOP.
Now we know that you can be on Face the Nation if you take SHOP. This is great.
So the only way you can get there.
So having that SHOP, that dual track, is a really important part of apprenticeship programs. Something that I believe that Donald Trump will focus on as president.
Is there something you can think of that would be symbolic, that would send that kind of strong signal that he sent with the Carrier operation?
Well, I think obviously spending time is perhaps the thing that you do that doesn't require legislation. It's how you use your time. We are intentional about using my time in a way that says to communities that have perhaps felt disenfranchised from the conservative movement, we care. We go there. We spend time. We listen. We don't come with solutions first. If Donald Trump will take the time and spend some time in Cleveland and Detroit and in Charleston and other places, I think he'll find that people are receptive to the person who invests their time, energy, and then their talents into solving problems.
You gave a speech back in July after the shootings in Baton Rouge and in Dallas, and you talked about, while there's so many officers that do good, you had experienced and seen those that did not.
In the course of 1 year, I've been stopped 7 times by law enforcement officers. Not 4, not 5, not 6, but 7 times in 1 year as an elected official. I have felt the anger, the frustration, the sadness, and the humiliation that comes with feeling like you're being targeted for nothing more than being just yourself.
What's been the reaction to that speech since then?
I think it's opened the eyes to a lot of folks who perhaps have listened to the cries and the screams and the shouts of others and disregarded those. I think perhaps my speaking out on the issue has validated the concerns of many African American males who've gone through similar situations, but it has said to others on the other side that perhaps there's some validity to the issue and we should take a second look.
The conversation over race, and particularly where policing gets involved, gets hot pretty fast.
Absolutely.
How bad has the pushback been?
I mean, I think some folks believe that, it's been fairly aggressive without any question, but listen, the way I look at it is you either do the right thing for the right reasons or you don't. Speaking out on something that is real is the right thing. Folks who believe that I'm feeding into a narrative, that's their problem, not mine. So I'm comfortable with where I am. It's not necessarily been a comfortable ride or journey, but it's been a necessary journey. But the good news is that disproportionately speaking, the response has been tremendously positive.
The story you're trying to tell goes back, it seems to me, to this idea of empathy, understanding that there are two views here.
Well, that's something I try to explain to both sides. Seek first to understand and then to be understood. Said differently, even those folks who, to be blunt, the black community leaders need to spend time doing ride-alongs with officers. You need to understand and appreciate the milliseconds that you may have in making decisions. You need to walk in those shoes for a little while. And by the same token, I encourage and sometimes aggressively encourage, spend some time in neighborhoods. I grew up in many of those neighborhoods. I was a poor kid in a single-parent household, living in a very small house. I understand the pain and the suffering, the challenges and frustration. You got to know the people that you are responsible or placed in charge of.
There are a lot of people who feel not only that Donald Trump doesn't represent them, but people of color who believe that he actively played on fears in the African American community, basically in urban areas, played on fears to get elected. How do you bridge that gap?
Anyone who watched this election and did not see that fear was a part of both sides of the aisle missed the election. I think we would have the same conversation had Hillary won. by the way, just perhaps a different perspective, but the same conversation of fear and frustration. So what I say to folks is, let's give Mr. Trump a chance. Let's gauge progress in his administration by what he does. And I'm going to hold him accountable, like every single American should hold all of our presidents accountable.
Charleston's had a tough couple of years.
Absolutely.
Walter Scott and the Mother Emanuel Church. Where are things now?
There certainly are sensitive times. There are levels of frustration without any question. There's a lot of hope, though. African American and white pastors coming together, asking our community to show the same type of resolve that we did after the Walter Scott shooting, after the Mother Emanuel shooting. We are one cohesive Charleston family, and we say we're Charleston strong. So the goal is to remain confident in the judicial process. I am confident that justice will be done.
All right, Senator Scott, thanks so much.
Yes, sir. Look forward to talking with you again.
The astronaut John Glenn died this week. In 1962, Glenn was the first American to orbit the Earth.
Godspeed, John Glenn. Roger, the clock is operating. We're underway.
As he rose into the blue on that February day, Glenn described his every sensation.
Oh, that view is tremendous.
When it was announced he'd be the jockey on the Atlas D rocket, news cameras gave him and his wife Annie a taste of a new phenomenon, the celebrity front lawn treatment. My mom was one of the ones trampling the grass.
This is Nancy Honchman in Arlington, Virginia, at the home of Colonel John Glenn. He's back here resting with his wife Annie and their 2 children on this very bitter cold morning in Virginia. The astronaut came out to answer questions from reporters.
Glenn's act of courage was a wonder to gaze at, but it was also a boost for Americans worried the Soviet Union and communism were winning. Glenn was proof that free societies could achieve greatness.
Cheering crowds roar a mighty welcome.
Glenn embodied every virtue Americans like to think they had as a birthright: honor, modesty, grit, and courage. He was all American. Now, when the television cameras come to the front lawn to record the latest outrage, John Glenn's death reminds us again what makes America great: character. And that there was a time when the quiet display of it was a thing that we gathered around the television to watch. Senator Glenn was 95. Godspeed, John Glenn. That's it for us today. Thanks for watching. Until next week for Face the Nation, I'm John Dickerson.